Alrighty, hey everybody, welcome to our, I think, third meeting of the year, might be the fourth one. But yeah, we're really happy to have you guys. Unfortunately, because school's super busy and because we had to end up changing the meeting date, a few of our more regular attendees weren't able to come. But for all of you guys who are watching on YouTube, awesome. And yeah, we're just going to get straight into it. So today we're kind of doing our club's quote unquote namesake. Obviously, we're students for well-balanced, effective education on drugs. We don't condone or support adolescent drug usage. However, our acronym is Students for Weed, and today we're going to be covering marijuana and cannabis. So with that, we're going to just kind of jump right in. Let me present. That would be a good thing. So anyways, jumping straight in, we're going to look at what marijuana is. So marijuana typically consists of the dried flowers of the Cannabis sativa plant. And for hundreds of years, this is how it was primarily consumed. You would dry the flowers of this plant, and then the vast majority of people would end up smoking this through a pipe or a joint or spliff or blunt. However, in recent years, it's been synthesized to be in a variety of products. So as you can see, just on the side, there are a few examples known as like wax and oil pens, so you can vape marijuana. There are bongs, which are just an alternative way for you to smoke marijuana. Joints, spliffs, and blunts, which are like ordered respectively at the bottom. There are edibles, which are, as the name suggests, ingestible marijuana that you can eat. And the majority of people either like bake or cook that into food that they have. And then there's also consumable marijuana in the form of drinks. And there are a variety of other means of ingestion, but these are just kind of the main ways that people nowadays end up consuming marijuana and getting high based off of it. So the drug's main psychoactive component is called THC, which is short for delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. And that's an incredibly long name. No one ever really calls it that outside of the like medical or clinical field. So the majority of people just call it THC. And one of the interesting things is a lot of scientists do label it as a psychoactive drug, but unlike a lot of other drugs, say methamphetamines, which are labeled as a stimulant, or opiates, which are labeled as depressants, marijuana has actually been labeled as both a stimulant, a depressant, and a psychoactive drug. Sometimes it is referred to as none of the above. And the reason why is because it acts on the endocannabinoid system, which we'll get into in a little bit. It produces a much wider variety of effects on its users than a lot of other drugs do. And THC concentration, that's THC is the main psychoactive component in the drug, varies wildly between different methods of ingestion and strains. So we'll get into this a little bit more later, but as of like 1995, the average potency of marijuana was roughly like 8 or 9% in the United States. As recently as 2015, this has spiked up to close to 15 and 16%. And in some methods of ingestion, for example, wax or oil pens, this can go as high as 80 or 90%. So THC concentration in marijuana varies dramatically between different methods of ingestion. So next, let's get to really what the endocannabinoid system is. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but THC acts on the endocannabinoid system and therefore stimulates cannabinoid receptors in the brain. So a lot of people hear the word cannabis or cannabinoid and immediately associate it with marijuana, but our brain naturally has cannabinoids that trigger different receptors in our brain. And what the endocannabinoid system does is it serves to regulate homeostasis, otherwise known as just like equilibrium throughout your body. And this can affect everything from your mood to your memory and psychological development to your sleep and motor control. And if you look at the little chart on the side, it's also related to regulating temperature, blood sugar levels, your pH, water and minerals, and metabolic waste. And so at the end of the day, the endocannabinoid system is really just the thing that balances your body out. And because of this, marijuana has the ability to affect a lot of different aspects of your body, both psychologically and physically. And as such, it can produce a wide variety of results in users, which we'll be getting to right now. So some of the short-term effects of marijuana, once again, it varies wildly based on the means of ingestion and the individual at hand, but they typically include the following. Firstly, euphoria. A lot of users of marijuana take it because it creates a very euphoric, happy feeling. And for many people, it relieves anxiety and just kind of creates this positive feeling or buzzed, kind of like buzzed emotion. In addition to that, it often leads to an increased appetite, what's oftentimes called the munchies, because a lot of people, when their endocannabinoid system is basically messed with by THC, their hunger or the neurons in their brain that stimulate hunger are kind of triggered and then say, hey, you should go eat something. So a lot of people, when they smoke or ingest marijuana, are then prompted to go find some food and chow down. In addition to that, however, although a lot of users do experience euphoria, a wide variety of users also talk about how they've experienced anxiety and paranoia. And anxiety and paranoia can happen in any individual, although if you have a predisposition to having anxiety disorders, or if you are already a fairly anxious, stressed, or paranoid person, this can kind of exacerbate that. And in addition, it varies wildly depending on your surroundings. For example, If you are at home alone or if you're with your friends just kind of hanging out, you're far less likely to experience anxiety, paranoia, or a panic attack than if you were in a very stressful situation. For example, if it's really loud, there are a lot of people, you're scared about, someone catching you because marijuana might be illegal in your state or country, etc. So really, at the end of the day, it can create a wide variety of effects when it comes to your emotional state, and it's dependent not only on you as an individual, but also your surroundings. In addition to that, it can lead to decreased motor control, as we mentioned, with the endocannabinoid system. It helps regulate just homeostasis across your body. And part of that is your body's and brain's ability to control your movements and fine motor skills. So this can be everything from being able to effectively text to being able to walk in a straight line, not be dizzy and continue to function normally. And so because it decreases your motor control, as well as your senses and thought, which we'll get into in a little bit, it's highly recommended and strongly advised by pretty much everyone unanimously that when you ingest marijuana, you should not, drive, operate heavy machinery, or do anything that could put you or others at risk because of negligence or incompetence. And so in addition to that, sorry about the screaming in the background. I have two toddler brothers who are just running around wreaking havoc. In addition to that, it can also create kind of an altered sense perception. So similar to other psychoactive drugs like LSD or DMT, albeit to a much more minor extent, it can alter your perception of the world around you. And this can create hallucinations or delusions, which can include, hearing sounds differently, perceiving colors, sights, and smells very differently, and also experiencing sights, sounds, and colors that really aren't there. So a lot of people will experience hearing voices that aren't there, quite simply just because marijuana is playing on the endocannabinoid system, and it's playing on their body's ability to accurately perceive what's going on around them. And in addition to this, it can lead to something known as disordered thought. So ultimately what marijuana does is it acts on regulators in your brain that basically tell you to perceive how important something is, right? And so if you're thinking about something, for example, oh, I'm going to go into work tomorrow, or oh, I'm going to go put coffee in a coffee pot and I'm going to start that brewing, or whatever it may be, your brain will usually tell you this isn't a super important task. You don't need to feel like this is very important. But when THC acts on the endocannabinoid system, it can actually alter these receptors and ultimately lead you to feel like everything is an epiphany. So everything from going outside to walk your dog, to going to grab some food, just to watching the cartoon that you're sitting on the couch and looking at, everything can feel much more significant because your body's and brain's ability to process the significance of various events in relevance to each other decreases. In addition to that, going along with disordered thought, a lot of people experience something known as time dilation, which basically means that time can pass much more quickly or much more slowly to that user. So they might sit there and think, wow, I've been here for hours and hours and it's only been 20 minutes. Or on the flip side, they can think, oh, it's been, quite a few minutes, but in actuality, it's been hours. In addition to that, bloodshot eyes are a very common symptom. A lot of people who smoke or otherwise ingest marijuana experience very red eyes, especially if they don't use it very often or if they're new to using it. And so this is something that a lot of people have made jokes about or kind of say is like a telltale giveaway of using marijuana. But in addition to that, it can also create changes in heart rate and blood pressure. So for some users, it will elevate their heart rate and elevate their blood pressure, very similar to what a stimulant might do. Whereas for others, it'll actually lower it, both heart rate and blood pressure, acting very similar to a depressant. So it really just depends on the individual, their pre-existing conditions, the method of ingestion or the strain of marijuana they're using. And there are a variety of other symptoms. These are just kind of some of the most common ones. And with that, Salem's going to get into some of the long-term effects of marijuana.
Yeah, so some of the biggest long-term effects that can affect users long-term can be anti-motivational syndrome, which is a phenomenon often associated with chronic cannabis usage, and it describes symptoms of apathy, decrease in ambition, decision-making, memory, concentration, commitment skills, and lack of energy. Similar to what Connor was talking about how things may not feel as important when THC interacts with your endocannabinoid system. Everything may just feel less important, leading to an anti-motivational state after prolonged use of cannabis. Additionally, the decreased cognition and attention span, multiple psychological studies, longitudinal and comparative, have proven that long-term users of cannabis, and this study is based on roughly 25 years of use, like daily almost. Most users have lower cognition, memory, and longer response times to stimuli. and lower attention spans. There's also a high risk of cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, which is a cannabis-induced ailment that manifests itself in severe nausea and vomiting amplified in the morning. So it's kind of similar to morning sickness that a lot of pregnant people experience. It's almost the exact same thing because it has to do with your emetics part of your gastrointestinal system, which is the higher part of your gastrointestinal system. And it just has to do with the dysfunction of the epigastric part of that system. And it can be relieved by hot showers and baths and completely stopped by taking breaks from cannabis use or complete cessation. Also, chronic cannabis users over a long time have led to a higher risk for psychotic behaviors such as full-on psychosis, schizophrenia, and with a focus on the symptom of hearing voices like Connor touched upon, along with having disordered thoughts, depression, and that one especially shows up in teens, which can be linked to the amotivational syndrome. And also substance use disorders, which we'll elaborate more on later in the presentation.
Definitely. And just a little bit of additional context to that. Going off of the psychosis point, something that a lot of people who use cannabis, or not a lot of people, but something that people who regularly or frequently ingest large amounts of cannabis can experience is what's a condition that's known as hallucinogenic persistent psychoactive disorder. And so essentially what this is, it's basically having flashbacks to hallucinations or delusions that you've had while under the influence of a given drug. It's much more common for stronger psychedelic and psychoactive drugs, for example, LSD and DMT, but it can happen with frequent use of marijuana. And as Salem mentioned, depression and other amotivational syndrome and other various long-term effects of cannabis use are much more pronounced in adolescence, which is why it's, all the better to wait until you're an adult if you do decide to use cannabis, just so that your brain is fully developed and is less prone to experiencing these long-term negative side effects. And so going on with that, what a lot of people do when they ingest cannabis or really any other drug is they oftentimes like to mix these drugs. And so we just kind of want to go over interactions with other substances. And so marijuana, because it can be classified as a depressant or as a stimulant, can have a variety of different effects when it mixes with different drugs. So marijuana, when mixed with antidepressants, for example, SSRIs, for example, like Prozac or Lexapro, can actually lead to something known as serotonin syndrome. And so basically what this does is it decreases your body's ability to regulate serotonin. So in the short term, you may experience like huge bouts of elation when you smoke marijuana and you're also using an SSRI. But in the long term, it actually decreases your body's ability to create, regulate, and process serotonin, leading to feelings of depression, an increase in the likelihood of anti-motivational syndrome, and other generally negative side effects dealing with mental health and one's emotional state. In addition to that, marijuana and depressants can amplify each other's effects, and this is also true of stimulants, which I'll get into in a second. But when marijuana acts as a depressant in the body and it suppresses heart rate, it suppresses blood pressure, and basically your ability to continue acting normally or continue doing things at the same rate that you usually do them, and you mix that with another drug that's a depressant, for example, Xanax or opiates, what you can end up doing is basically having them amplify or play off of each other. And so what you might experience is that your heart rate drops to an incredibly dangerous level, your blood pressure drops to an incredibly dangerous level, which can ultimately lead to, heart failure. It can lead to death. It can lead to a variety of different things, just as your bodily systems aren't able to function, because not only do they have one substance that are acting on them, kind of suppressing them, but they suddenly have a second one that's doing the same. Similarly, it can act the same as stimulants. So for example, if you take methamphetamines or cocaine or ecstasy or other stimulant drugs that increase your heart rate, increase your temperature, increase your blood pressure, and you take marijuana at the same time, you could experience basically like doubling the effects, which means that your heart rate could spike to an unsafe level and you could suffer from something like a heart attack, your blood pressure could increase, and if you have various medical or health related conditions, this obviously wouldn't be very beneficial for you. Your body temperature could reach an incredibly dangerous level, which could lead to ultimately you overheating and dying of that. And so at the end of the day, we're not trying to fearmonger by any means. When you ingest marijuana, we want you to be able to do it safely, but like many other drugs, the safest way to ingest cannabis, if you're going to do so, is without mixing with other drugs. And probably one of the most common drug combos that are used is marijuana and alcohol. And as we already kind of touched on within our alcohol video that we did 2 months ago, when you ingest alcohol and your body has decided like, okay, this is a bit too much, my liver is unable to process this anymore, your body's go-to reaction is to throw it up. And this essentially helps you avoid alcohol poisoning because it's removing that excess alcohol from your body much faster than your liver would be able to metabolize it. Unfortunately, when you smoke marijuana, it can temporarily, or at least in the short term, lead to an inability for your body to vomit. Also, although in the long term it can create emesis based disorders that give you morning sickness or cause you to repeatedly vomit. In the short term, when you're actually high or once you've recently consumed marijuana, it can make it much harder for your body to actually vomit. And so if your body is trying to get rid of excess alcohol, or if your body is trying to avoid alcohol poisoning and you ingest both marijuana and alcohol, it can actually lead to you dying of alcohol poisoning because your body is no longer able to get rid of the excess alcohol in a fast enough or quick enough manner. And so just kind of like going over that, we wanted to make sure that if you are going to use any of these drugs, you're doing so in the safest manner possible, which would be to avoid mixing them and avoid any unforeseen consequences.
So next I'm going to go over some symptoms of addiction. So first, I wanted to elaborate on that it's important to recognize that while cannabis is not physically addictive, it is psychologically addictive, and many gain a physical dependence on it after prolonged usage, especially those who self-medicate. So just wanted to clear that up before I go into the symptoms of addiction. Many experience substance use disorders, and they're usually classified into 3 different categories based on a self-report of the following symptoms: uncontrollable usage, unsuccessful attempts to decrease usage, high tolerance development, inability to manage responsibilities because of usage, and sacrificing relationships or important social, recreational, or occupational activities for it in substitution of usage. Mild cases usually score a 2 to 3 on this self-report. Moderate usually scores a 4 to 5, and severe scores a 6, between a 6 and 7. Usually substance use disorders are genetically inherited, but they can be developed on one's own self and then potentially passed on to further generations. But this isn't something that happens to everybody. This usually just does happen to people who use daily and increase their usage through the gaining of a tolerance. Oh, sorry, my dog is crying because my dad just got home. Anyways, also many experience a mood change, like based on either withdrawal symptoms or the actual addiction to the substance. Many experience depressive symptoms, especially in the first few days of sobriety. Depending on your like usage consistency, it could be even in the first few hours of sobriety. But many experience like irritability or anxiety whenever they're not high on cannabis. And this can even just be like throughout the day waiting to, like, for example, like get home from work and get high or something like that. And it can be very extreme mood changes once one like ingests it and like comes back to their like baseline level of being high. There's also progression of increased tolerance, which I talked about in substance use disorders. Basically, I'm assuming we've gone over tolerances, but just going back to touch on it, essentially what a tolerance is body's tolerance of a substance, so much so that the effects of the substance require more ingestion of said substance to like actually have like the same effects as normal. So for example, if you like smoke one joint regularly, like smoke one joint a day, after a while, you're not going to get as high from smoking one joint a day. You're going to need more to get you to the same level of highness as you continue to increase your tolerance. I already went over withdrawal symptoms, but yeah, a lot of people experience anxiety, irritability. Some can also experience hyperemesis when going through withdrawals. Amotivational syndrome is a huge one of addiction, similar to the long-term usage, lack of control over usage, consistency and amounts, and priorities change to cannabis usage over anything else.
And the next thing that we wanted to highlight is treatment and resources that are available. So Salem's also going to cover this.
Yeah, so a lot of psychiatrists use a three-step model when working with patients who are suffering from cannabis addiction. So many may admit themselves to a psychiatric ward or rehab center where they will work with psychiatrists or psychotherapists. And they use a three-step model that uses positive reinforcement, such as rewards for negative drug screenings. This is usually when practicing abstinence. There's also like rewards and self-reports of decreased or controlled usage and motivational enhancement, which can be seen in humanistic therapy that creates a support system while recognizing and accommodating for realistic factors and substitution methods, such as developing other coping mechanisms, especially for those who self-medicate in order to cease chronic usage or decrease it at the very least. Pharmacologically, there isn't too much to consider, but there is one study of N-acetylcysteine proving to help decrease the cravings of THC and restore the natural harmony in the endocannabinoid system, and those who suffer from dependency and or psychological addiction. Also, just any sort of imbalance in your homeostasis, because too much usage of THC will bring your body out of homeostasis. And then here are some resources for those who feel they may be addicted. There's a marijuana rehab and addiction treatment centers that you can like just plug in your location to and get resources like based on your location. There's also information about marijuana addiction with effects or withdrawal and treatment, and marijuana treatment and rehab recovering from marijuana addiction.
Definitely. And we'll touch on this a little bit more, but in places where marijuana is legalized or at least decriminalized, it's significantly easier to receive these forms of treatment just because there aren't as many legal barriers. There's not the stigmatization and there's not the fear of like, if I try and go in for treatment, if I try and go in for rehab, am I going to potentially be like legally punished or reprimanded? And we'll go into that in a little bit, but also for all of these resources and for the ones that we post at the end, we're going to obviously link those in the description for the YouTube video. And additionally, and again, we'll say this again at the end, but if you guys have any questions, any comments, any concerns, you can always feel free to email us, and I'll drop our email in the description as well. But
yeah. Lastly, I'm just going to go into the effects of criminalization, and I'm going to touch upon them, and then Connor will also elaborate. So the criminalization of marijuana started like way long ago, but was really amplified due to the war on drugs, which President Nixon enacted. And we won't go into the whole like political history of it, but essentially it was rooted in systemic racism because there was a huge stigma of marijuana usage in Black and Brown communities, especially in the Los Angeles area. And there was a huge crisis where, and still is, where many people believe that all immigrants are smuggling weed from especially Latin American countries such as like Mexico, due to that's our bordering country, and other countries that have been stigmatized due to the few drug cartels that have been like actually been smuggling into the United States. This entire stigmatization has been rooted in systemic racism and disproportionately affects Black and Brown people. And because of this, especially Black men are 4 times more likely to end up in jail for marijuana usage, even if it's nonviolent, and will receive punishments significantly longer and more intense than their white counterparts. It also disproportionately affects those who use medically, and often like takes away the resources that they may need, especially those who suffer from mental health conditions and or cancer. There are also plenty of other people who suffer from different health conditions all across the board that may self-medicate. Weed has also been heavily stigmatized as a gateway drug. And because it is still a Schedule I drug in the United States, it is stigmatized as severe, as being as severe as harder drugs such as like meth or cocaine or anything of the sort that is obviously significantly more harmful to the human body than weed is, because weed is a far more natural substance. Obviously, they're all natural because they're all derived from the earth, but weed is definitely the most natural drug.
Definitely. And kind of related to that, for those of you who live in the United States, all of this is very pertinent. In the vast majority of other developed nations, there is less stigmatization and less criminalization of drugs, but that's not always true. South Korea has incredibly strict drug laws, but then there are countries like Portugal, Switzerland, and the Netherlands that have in recent decades moved towards decriminalizing drugs. So just kind of to add a little bit onto what Salem already mentioned, they covered a lot of like really amazing points about the effects of criminalization, but looking at systemic racism a little bit more, drugs like marijuana are used pretty much across the board by adolescents and individuals of all races and backgrounds and ethnicities. However, the Brookings Institute found in 2014 that although Black and white adolescents are equally as likely to use drugs like marijuana, the former are 10 times more likely to be incarcerated on these charges, which is why when you look at the United States having the largest prison population of any country in the world, tens of thousands of the millions of people who are incarcerated on nonviolent drug offenses. For example, the possession, distribution, or ingestion of marijuana or other drugs. And ultimately, one of the main reasons why this is harmful, as Salem brought up, is that it doesn't actually necessarily give these people the help that they need. If you are addicted to drugs, or if you're using drugs like medicinally, and you're thrown in prison for it, you're ultimately not receiving the either mental or physical help that you need in order to be the healthiest individual that you can be. But in addition to that, what we found is that a lot of individuals, because marijuana is criminalized, have been cutting it essentially with other substances. So if you'll remember back to 2018, 2019, there was a huge scare about vaping specifically, and a lot of people were linking vaping to popcorn lung and deaths across the United States. And it was later revealed that it was specifically marijuana or THC containing vapes. And very specifically beyond that, it was marijuana vapes that were being sold on the black market, in which the oil was containing vitamin E acetate, which is perfectly fine to ingest like edibly, but in terms of like your lungs and inhaling that, not so great. And so at the end of the day, because marijuana is criminalized and because there isn't like a regulated and legalized market for it, it's incredibly difficult to A, know what's in the marijuana that you're consuming, and B, a lot of the marijuana that's on the market has been cut with these much more dangerous substances. In addition to that, a lot of people have the notion that like if we criminalize drugs, it'll be harder to get them and they won't be as accessible. But this actually necessarily isn't true. The Journal of Child Psychology and Child Psychiatry found as recently as 2017 that it's much easier for adolescents and teenagers to get illegal drugs like marijuana than it is for them to get legal drugs like alcohol. And this is essentially because with the market for alcohol, there is a defined age limit, and therefore the majority of people who want to use these drugs have the ability to do so. They're 21 or older, and therefore they're able to buy their own alcohol. There's not a flourishing black market for it that already exists that adolescents can then tap into. This isn't true for marijuana, however, as for the vast majority of people in the United States, dispensaries aren't readily accessible, and therefore people rely on a black market for it. But in addition to that, people think, well, at least it's not getting worse, right? Like people aren't ingesting stronger and stronger marijuana, even though we've seen that in recent decades they have. And as is pretty common knowledge nowadays, marijuana today is much stronger than it was in the 80s or 90s, and even that was stronger than it was in the 60s or 70s. And this is because ultimately, as a result of criminalization, the Library of Economics and Liberty went on to explain that drugs aren't like other commodities in terms of economics, in that when people want other commodities, if they're illegal, they oftentimes won't go to extreme measures to get them. Whereas with drugs, especially for people who are addicted, they are far more likely to end up doing whatever they can to get these drugs, which ultimately leads to an increase in potency, so that whoever's smuggling or distributing it can get it to their consumers in the most cost-effective manner for them. So ultimately, as a result, from 1995 to 2015, marijuana and THC potency in marijuana has almost tripled. And so at the end of the day, criminalization hasn't necessarily been benefiting really anyone involved. And beyond that, it's decreased our ability to accurately help people who need treatment. Whether you're addicted to marijuana and it's much harder to get treatment because of criminalization, or you use it medicinally and it's very difficult for you to have access to it, or you quite simply want to use it recreationally but are unsure of the consequences, because it's so heavily criminalized and stigmatized in society, it's very difficult for any real research or analysis to be done on its effects and its safety. And so as a result, we're not advocating for individuals to use marijuana, but we are saying that if you are going to use marijuana or any other substance, you ought to be able to do so in the safest way possible. And in many cases, and throughout history and looking at other countries as well, the safest way to do so would be a world in which there are available resources and support systems. There is accessibility on like information, and decriminalization ultimately kind of paves a pathway to all of these, to really all of these steps. And so with that, we have a bunch of additional resources here. We're going to be linking those in the description for the YouTube video. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to email us at studentsforweed@gmail.com. The 4 is the number 4, so students, number 4, weed@gmail.com. And yeah, you can also always comment on our YouTube videos, or just like, contact us in any other way that you deem fit. If you want to know more about this, if you want to see the sources we cite, if you want to see the resources that we have available here, or really if you just want to learn more about these issues in general. But thank you so much for joining us, or thank you so much for watching. Yeah, have a great day, everybody.